Somewhere in the central Pacific, there is a lagoon where you can swim past a fighter plane still sitting in its hangar, a truck still loaded with supplies, and a ship's galley with plates stacked on a shelf, exactly where someone left them more than 80 years ago. Nobody moved any of it. Nobody could. By the time anyone went looking, the entire base was already on the bottom of the ocean, and it has stayed almost untouched ever since. This is not a shipwreck story. This is the story of how an entire military base, one of the most heavily fortified places on Earth, disappeared in 2 days. And stay with me, because the detail that explains why no one talks about this the way they talk about Pearl Harbor comes right at the end. In the years before World War II, the Japanese Empire quietly turned a remote atoll called Truk into the largest naval base in the Pacific. From the outside, almost nobody knew what was there. 5 airstrips, a seaplane base, submarine repair facilities, fuel storage holding more oil than anywhere else outside the Japanese home islands, anchorage space for the core of the combined fleet. Allied planners who eventually learned what was hidden behind that reef gave it a nickname, the Gibraltar of the Pacific. For years, that reputation alone was enough to keep anyone from attempting an attack. Then, in early February 1944, American reconnaissance planes flying out of the Solomon Islands got close enough to photograph what was actually anchored inside the lagoon: battleships, cruisers, submarines, aircraft carriers, dozens of merchant ships and fuel tankers, packed into a single sheltered harbor, almost all of it sitting still, waiting. The Japanese knew they had been spotted. With days to prepare, they pulled their largest warships out to safer waters. But the base itself, its aircraft, its smaller warships, and the merchant fleet that kept it supplied, stayed exactly where it was. At 5 in the morning on February 17th, the first wave of American fighters launched, clearing the skies and crippling the airfields, before Japanese planes could organize any real defense. The ones that did get airborne were met by overwhelming numbers and shot down in one of the largest aerial battles of the war. Over the next 2 days, American carrier aircraft methodically worked through the lagoon, bombing and torpedoing anything still afloat. Ships that tried to flee through the lagoon's narrow passages were caught either from the air or by American warships waiting outside. One light cruiser, attempting to escape, was hit by a bomb and a torpedo and broke apart, sinking with hundreds of crew still aboard. When it was over, more than 36 Japanese warships and merchant vessels had been sunk, and hundreds of aircraft destroyed, most of them without ever firing a shot in their own defense. The base's fuel reserves, the largest stockpile Japan had outside its home islands, went up in flames almost entirely. An admiral was relieved of command within days. One of history's most heavily fortified naval bases had been functionally erased in under 48 hours. Here's the part that should stop you. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz summed up what had just happened in a single deliberate sentence. The American fleet had paid Japan back for Pearl Harbor, in kind, at Truk. And yet, ask most people today what happened at Truk Lagoon, and you'll get silence. Ask the same people about Pearl Harbor, or Midway, or Iwo Jima, and they'll know immediately that gap is not an accident. Because Truk was destroyed so completely in just 2 days, American military planners realized they no longer needed to invade it. An amphibious assault, the kind of operation that had already cost enormous numbers of lives at places like Tarawa, simply wasn't necessary anymore. The United States bypassed it entirely, leaving the surviving Japanese garrison stranded on the atoll for the rest of the war, cut off from supplies, fighting to grow enough food to survive, rather than fighting any battle at all. A victory this complete simply stopped being useful as a story. No island-hopping campaign followed it. No dramatic ground assault for newsreels to capture. Just an empty lagoon, slowly disappearing from public memory. A 2024 study in the Journal of Maritime Archaeology put it plainly: Truk has never received the historical examination battles like Midway received, precisely because it was considered a clean, low-cost success and then bypassed. So the wreckage sat there, untouched, unrecovered, forgotten by almost everyone except the people of the islands themselves, who lived alongside the rusting hulks visible just beneath the surface for the next 25 years. Then, in 1969, the French oceanographer Jacques Cousteau brought his cameras to the lagoon, and that changed everything. What he and his team found defied belief, because the ships had been moored in water far deeper than Japanese salvage divers could reach at the time, and because the war ended before anyone could return to recover them. The wrecks were essentially abandoned exactly as they sank. Cargo holds still packed with supplies, aircraft still sitting in their hangars, personal items still in place in crew quarters, a snapshot of a military base frozen at the exact moment its war ended, preserved underwater instead of erased by time. His documentary introduced the world to what divers now simply call the world's largest ship graveyard. More than 60 wrecks rest on the lagoon floor. Today, ranging from massive supply ships to fighter planes, encrusted in decades of coral growth that has slowly turned steel hulls into artificial reefs. But this isn't simply a diving destination. The government of the Federated States of Micronesia has formally designated these wrecks as war graves, protected by law, because somewhere among that wreckage, dozens of American servicemen from the February raids, and by some estimates more than 200 from later strikes on the same lagoon, are still listed as missing. Their final resting place, the same waters tourists now swim through to see history preserved in coral and rust. That's the real weight of what's down there. Not just steel and cargo, but people who never came home, in a place most of the world stopped talking about the moment it succeeded too completely to need a sequel. Truk Lagoon is proof that the most devastating victories aren't always the ones we remember. Sometimes, the battle that worked too well is the one that gets erased from the story, while the wreckage it left behind quietly becomes one of the most extraordinary places on Earth. If you had heard of Truk Lagoon before today, write "heard" in the comments below. If this is the first time this story has ever reached you, write "unknown" to lock in your answer and take your place in the next investigation.